The fortress has held for 150 years. Its walls are 15 feet thick. It was built by the greatest military engineers in Christendom, and Baybars takes it in 3 days. When the garrison surrenders, he offers them safe passage, then has every single one of them killed. He doesn't need their fortress, he needs their fear. Because this isn't a war, this is an extinction. And the most terrifying part? The people being destroyed could have stopped it at any time. They were too busy fighting each other to notice they were already dead.
Last episode, we watched a former slave named Baybars help defeat the Mongols at Ain Jalut, the first time the most powerful army on Earth had ever lost an open battle. Then he murdered the sultan who'd led that victory and took the throne for himself. Now he's about to turn his attention to the Crusaders, and what he does to them over the next 15 years is one of the most methodical campaigns of destruction in medieval history. But here's the thing, and this is what makes this story so much more than just a list of sieges. Baybars didn't destroy the Crusader states. The Crusader states destroyed themselves. He just showed up to collect the pieces. This video isn't really about the Crusades. It's about a question that applies to every empire, every institution, every civilization that has ever existed. Why do powerful things collapse from the inside? And what can the death of the Crusader states, a civilization that had survived for nearly 2 centuries, teach us about how that collapse actually works?
The Crusader states in the 1260s were, on paper, still impressive, a chain of fortresses and port cities stretching along the eastern Mediterranean coast, from Antioch in the north to Jaffa in the south. Some of these fortresses were engineering marvels, the finest military architecture in the medieval world. Crac des Chevaliers, Chateau Pellerin, the citadel of Acre, walls that were 10, 12, 15 feet thick, with concentric defensive rings, murder holes, arrow slits, and towers positioned so that every approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. They'd been there for over 160 years. Multiple Muslim armies had tried to dislodge them and failed. Saladin himself, the most famous Muslim general in Western popular culture, had taken Jerusalem in 1187, but never managed to eliminate the Crusader presence entirely. These were tough, entrenched positions held by military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, who were essentially professional standing armies in an age when most European warfare was fought by seasonal feudal levies. On paper, this should have been an extremely hard target. But here's what the paper doesn't tell you. By the 1260s, the Crusader states were a shell, and the rot went all the way to the core. Problem 1, Europe had stopped caring. The First Crusade in 1096 had been a continent-wide religious movement, kings, princes, and peasants all marching east to reclaim the Holy Land. By the mid-1200s, that fervor was gone. European monarchs were busy fighting each other. The Pope was locked in a power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor. Crusading had become expensive, unpopular, and politically inconvenient. The disastrous Seventh Crusade of 1248, where King Louis IX of France invaded Egypt, got his entire army captured and had to be ransomed back, had humiliated the movement. When the Crusader states sent desperate pleas for reinforcements, Europe sent thoughts and prayers. Sound familiar? Problem 2, the Italian merchant republics were at war with each other inside the very cities they were supposed to be defending. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa had established massive trading quarters in the Crusader port cities, especially Acre. These quarters were essentially independent city-states within the city, with their own walls, their own militias, and their own agendas. And their agenda was money, not holy war. In 1256, just 4 years before Ain Jalut, Venice and Genoa went to actual war inside the city of Acre. Not a skirmish, a full-scale urban battle called the War of St. Savas. Venetian and Genoese soldiers fought house to house in a Crusader city, while Muslim armies gathered on the horizon. The Templars backed Venice, the Hospitallers backed Genoa. The military orders that were supposed to be defending Christendom were instead fighting each other over trade disputes and real estate. Imagine the Allied forces at D-Day stopping to have a civil war on the beach. That's what was happening in the Crusader states. Problem 3, the local Crusader nobility had gone native, or rather had developed their own local interests that had nothing to do with Europe's religious mission. After 6 or 7 generations in the Levant, many Crusader families spoke Arabic as well as French. Crusader lords made alliances with Muslim rulers when it suited them. They traded with the enemy, they married into local families, they fought other Crusader lords for territory with more enthusiasm than they fought Muslims. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which hadn't actually controlled Jerusalem since Saladin took it back in 1187, was paralyzed by succession disputes, with multiple factions claiming the crown and none strong enough to unify the others. And problem 4, the one that Baybars would exploit most ruthlessly, the Crusader states had no strategic depth whatsoever. They controlled a narrow coastal strip, rarely more than 50 miles wide at any point. Every fortress they lost shortened the chain. Every port they lost cut a supply line to Europe. There was no fallback position, no hinterland to retreat into, no room for even a single strategic error. One sustained campaign by a competent enemy would unravel the whole thing like pulling a thread from a tapestry. And Baybars was far, far more than merely competent.
Everything I just described, the infighting, the merchant wars, the succession crises, Europe's indifference, Baybars knew all of it. He had spies in every Crusader city. He knew which lords hated which other lords. He knew which military orders were feuding. He knew exactly which fortresses were undermanned and which supply lines were vulnerable. And in 1265, he stopped watching and started cutting. Not with a single massive invasion, with a scalpel, one fortress at a time. Baybars's campaign against the Crusaders wasn't a war in any traditional sense. It was a dismantlement, a careful strategic demolition of a civilization, piece by piece, carried out by a man who understood that the fastest way to destroy a house is to remove its load-bearing walls, one at a time. In 1265, he hit Caesarea and Arsuf, 2 important coastal fortresses that anchored the southern end of the Crusader defensive chain. Caesarea fell quickly. Baybars's siege engineers, many of them trained using techniques inherited from the Mongol campaigns, made short work of the outdated fortifications. After capture, the city was systematically demolished, every wall, every tower, every cistern destroyed so it could never be reoccupied. This became Baybars's signature move and his most brilliant strategic innovation. He didn't just conquer fortresses, he erased them. He'd tear down the walls, fill in the moats, collapse the tunnels, destroy every piece of infrastructure. A conquered fortress that still stood could be recaptured in the next crusade. A pile of rubble couldn't. Think of it as a medieval scorched earth policy applied to architecture. Arsuf held out longer. The Knights Hospitallers defended it with the desperate courage their order was famous for. But it fell too. Same treatment. Walls torn down, garrison killed or enslaved, fortress reduced to nothing usable. And while the Crusaders reeled from these losses, Baybars was already moving. In 1266, he besieged the massive Templar fortress of Safed in the Galilee Hills, one of the strongest inland positions the Crusaders held. When the garrison finally surrendered after weeks of bombardment, Baybars offered them safe passage. They walked out. He had them all executed. This wasn't madness, it was strategy. Every broken promise of safe passage made the next garrison more likely to fight to the death, yes, but it also made every garrison that heard about it more terrified. And terror, Baybars understood, was a weapon. Meanwhile, what were the Crusaders doing in response to this systematic destruction of their defensive network? Fighting each other. The various factions couldn't agree on a unified military response. The Templars guarded their fortresses and ignored the Hospitallers' losses. The Hospitallers did the same in reverse. Individual Crusader lords tried to negotiate separate truces with Baybars, which he happily signed, used as cover to attack their neighbors, and then violated whenever it suited him. Each lord thought he could save himself by cutting a private deal. None of them could. It's one of the most frustrating patterns in history, a civilization being eaten alive while its leaders argue about dinner. And this is where things get really dark. Because Baybars wasn't just conquering territory, he was waging psychological war on an industrial scale, and doing it with a sophistication that puts him centuries ahead of his time. He sent mocking letters to Crusader leaders after every victory, written in elaborate rhetorical Arabic designed to maximize humiliation. He paraded Crusader banners through Muslim cities in triumphal processions. He deliberately timed his attacks to coincide with Christian holy days, hitting fortresses on Good Friday, launching assaults during Easter week, storming walls on the Feast of Assumption, because he understood the psychological devastation of being defeated on the days you consider most sacred. Every timing was a message: your God cannot protect you. He also cultivated a network of diplomatic relations that systematically isolated the Crusaders from any potential ally they might have called on. He corresponded with the Byzantine emperor. He negotiated with European monarchs. He played the Mongol successor states against each other. Baybars was running a medieval foreign policy operation that was centuries ahead of anything the Crusaders could match. The Crusader states weren't being outfought, they were being outthought. And then, in 1268, Baybars turned his attention to the biggest prize of all, Antioch, one of the oldest and most important cities in all of Christendom, the place where followers of Jesus were first called Christians according to the Book of Acts, one of the original Crusader conquests, taken during the blood-soaked siege of 1098 that defined the entire First Crusade, a city that had been in Christian hands for 170 years through generations of war, plague, and earthquake, a city whose prince, Bohemond VI, wasn't even present when the end came. He was in Tripoli, managing his other territories, apparently confident that Antioch's massive fortifications would hold without his direct oversight. They didn't.
Antioch fell in May 1268. The siege lasted just 4 days. A city that had been Christian for 170 years, a city with walls that had survived dozens of previous attacks, collapsed in under a week. Baybars' army stormed the fortifications and did what Mongol armies and Muslim armies had failed to do for nearly 2 centuries. The sack was devastating. Thousands killed, thousands more enslaved. The city was systematically looted and burned. And then, Baybars did something extraordinary. He sat down and wrote a letter. The letter Baybars wrote to Prince Bohemond VI of Antioch is one of the most savage pieces of correspondence in medieval history. It's worth understanding what it actually said, not word for word because the original is in Arabic and quite long, but in spirit. Baybars knew Bohemond hadn't been present for the fall of his own city, so the letter is essentially a guided tour of destruction, written specifically so that Bohemond would know exactly what he'd lost while he was somewhere else. Baybars described what happened to Antioch's churches, burned, its markets, looted, its people, enslaved or killed. He described the wealth that was seized, the treasures carried away. And then he twisted the knife with surgical precision. He told Bohemond that he wished the prince had been there to see it, to see his churches burning, his people dying, his treasury being emptied.
He painted a picture of the destruction so vivid that it functioned as psychological warfare delivered by mail. The tone wasn't rage, it wasn't triumph, it was mockery, cold, precise, designed to humiliate. It was the letter of a man who understood that destroying a city isn't enough. You have to destroy the idea that the city could ever come back. Historians have called it one of the most remarkable documents of the crusading era. And it worked. After Antioch, the remaining Crusader states entered a death spiral. The Crusader leadership knew they were finished unless Europe intervened massively and immediately. They sent embassy after embassy to the courts of France, England, the Pope, anyone who would listen. The response was almost nothing. A few small expeditions, some money, some sympathetic words. Nothing close to what was needed. In 1271, the English Prince Edward, the future King Edward, arrived with a tiny force of maybe 1,000 men. He accomplished almost nothing militarily, but did manage to negotiate a 10-year truce with Baybars. That truce bought the Crusaders time, but time, without reform, just meant a slower death. Baybars died in 1277, possibly from drinking poisoned kumis meant for someone else, though the exact circumstances are debated. But his work was essentially complete. He had transformed the Mamluk Sultanate from a regional power into the dominant force in the Middle East. He had destroyed the Crusader strategic position beyond recovery, and the machine he'd built kept running after he was gone. His successors, particularly Sultan Kalawin and his son al-Ashraf Khalil, continued the systematic campaign. In 1289, Tripoli fell. The second-to-last major Crusader city was stormed, and its population massacred or scattered. The city was demolished afterward, same playbook Baybars had established. Every building, every wall, every church, leveled so it could never serve as a Christian stronghold again. And then came Acre, May 21st, 1991, the last major Crusader city in the Holy Land. Acre had been the de facto capital of the Crusader states for a century. It was the most heavily fortified city the Crusaders held. Double walls, massive towers, a garrison that included every remaining military order. Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, all of them, side by side, for the last time. The Mamluk army that arrived outside the walls numbered over 60,000 men, the largest Muslim force assembled since Saladin's era. Against them, the defenders of Acre had perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 soldiers. The siege lasted 43 days of relentless bombardment, mining, and assault. And even now, even at the very end, the Crusaders couldn't stop fighting each other. Different factions within the city disagreed on whether to negotiate, fight, or evacuate. The Venetians and Genoese jockeyed for position on the evacuation ships. The military orders argued over command. On May 18, 1991, the Mamluks breached the walls. The fighting in the streets was desperate and savage. The Templars made their last stand in their fortress. The building collapsed on top of them, killing both the defenders and the attackers who had stormed it. By the end of the day, Acre had fallen. The remaining Crusader holdouts, Sidon, Beirut, Tortosa, surrendered or abandoned within months. 196 years after the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, the Christian presence in the Holy Land was over.
The fall of Acre didn't just end the Crusader states, it ended an entire way of thinking about the relationship between Europe and the Middle East. For nearly 200 years, the idea of a permanent European military presence in the Holy Land had been a defining feature of European identity, politics, and religion. Popes had built their authority on it. Kings had bankrupted their treasuries for it. Thousands of ordinary Europeans had marched east and died for it. And now, it was over. The psychological shock in Europe was enormous. There was no triumphant Muslim counter-narrative that penetrated Western consciousness.
Most Europeans simply processed Acre's fall as a failure, a divine punishment, or a sign that the world was ending. Plans for new crusades were drawn up for decades afterward, but none ever materialized into serious action. The age of the Crusades was over, even if Europe took a long time to admit it. But here's what makes this story matter beyond medieval history. The pattern the Crusader states followed, from establishment to peak to internal decay to collapse, is one of the most consistent patterns in the history of civilizations, and it always looks the same. First, the founding generation has a clear mission and the willingness to sacrifice for it. Then, success breeds complacency. The mission gets replaced by economics, trade, wealth, personal advancement. Internal factions form and start competing with each other more than they compete with external threats. The homeland loses interest and stops investing. Alliances of convenience replace principled solidarity, and by the time the external threat arrives in force, the internal structure is so hollowed out that it can't mount a coherent defense. The Crusader states followed this pattern almost perfectly, but so did the Western Roman Empire. So did the British Empire's colonial holdings. So did the Soviet Union. The specific details change. The pattern doesn't. Baybars understood this pattern intuitively, even if he couldn't have articulated it in those terms. He didn't need to build an army capable of destroying the Crusader states at their peak strength. He just needed to wait until the rot did most of the work for him, and then apply pressure at the weakest points. He was, in a sense, history's most patient exterminator, and the Crusader states were a building that had already been condemned. The Middle East that emerged after 1291 was fundamentally reshaped. The Mamluk Sultanate controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Islam. The Crusader military orders retreated to Cyprus, Rhodes, and eventually Malta. The Templars, who had lost their reason for existence, were disbanded and destroyed by the King of France in 1307, their wealth seized, their leaders burned at the stake, and the Holy Land entered a new chapter that would last until the Ottoman conquest in 1517.
Empires don't die the way you think they do. They don't get conquered by a stronger enemy, not really. What happens is simpler and sadder. They stop believing in the thing that made them worth building in the first place. The Crusader states weren't destroyed by Baybars. They were destroyed by Venetian merchants who cared more about profit than defense, by military orders that fought each other instead of the enemy, by European kings who couldn't be bothered to help, by the slow, quiet replacement of mission with self-interest. Baybars was just the last thing they saw. Every civilization thinks it's the exception. Every civilization thinks its walls are thick enough, its institutions strong enough, its enemies distant enough. And every civilization learns the same lesson, always too late. The walls don't matter if the people inside them have already given up.
Here's my question for you, and I think there are genuinely multiple right answers to this one. Was the fall of the Crusader states inevitable? Could anything have saved them? A different leader, a different strategy, more help from Europe? Or was the internal decay so deep that no amount of external support could have changed the outcome? Drop your take in the comments. Now, we've spent 3 episodes in the 13th century Middle East. Baghdad's fall, the Mamluks' rise, the Crusaders' collapse. But there's a thread running through all of it that we haven't pulled on yet: the Mongol Empire. We watched them destroy Baghdad. We watched them lose at Ain Jalut. But what happened to them after that? Because the Mongol Empire didn't just disappear, it fractured into 4 massive successor states that fought each other for generations. And the story of that fracture, the civil wars, the betrayals, the question of what happens when the most powerful empire in history tears itself apart, is one of the most epic and least told stories in all of history. That's coming next. Subscribe and hit the bell. This is History Rewind. I'll see you in the next one.